Oh,
We are checking whether Olga and Paul James is in the waiting list.
Good afternoon. Welcome to everybody joining the webinar Reconsidering European Union's Partnership and Cooperation Models on Return and Readmission. This webinar is part of a webinar series jointly organized by 7 Horizon Europe projects working on irregular migration, returns, and readmissions. Today, this is the third one of this webinar series. The next one will be on politics of irregularity, which will take place on 13th of March. And our colleague will share the information and the details in the chat. And at the very end, we will share the poster about this upcoming webinar as well. Today, we have the coordinators of 3 of Return Horizon projects working on returns and readmissions, together with Professor Paul James Cardwell from King's College, London. Let me first very briefly present the speakers and then start with our webinar. Professor Cardwell is a professor of law based at the Dixon Poon School of Law, King's College, London. His main research areas are European Union external relations and migration, and has published extensively about this topic, 3 books, and there is one monograph almost about to be finalized. Professor Cardwell can tell us about that, The Governance of External Migration in Europe, which will appear at Oxford University Press. We have Professor Zeynep Mencütek. She's a political scientist with a background in international relations, based at Bonn International Center for Conflict Studies. Zeynep is the coordinator of Horizon Project, Horizon Europe GAPS project, which studies the drivers of return policies, barriers and enablers in international cooperation on returns. The main focus of GAPS is to examine the disconnects or the gaps between expectations of return policies and their actual outcomes by decentering the dominant and one-sided understanding of return policy making. Just very briefly. We have Professor Arjen Leerkes, based from Erasmus Rotterdam University. Professor Leerkes is the coordinator of FAIR project, Finding Agreement in Returns. Similarly, FAIR studies European Union return migration governance by addressing the legitimacy deficits. And FAIR systematically assess the importance of norms, frames, and shared meanings for intergovernmental cooperation and returns. Our fourth speaker is Professor Olga Jubany from University of Barcelona. Professor Jubany is a social anthropologist and the coordinator of the 3rd return project, just recently started, More: Motivations, Experiences, and the Consequences of Returns and Readmissions Policy. I guess she will make a short presentation about her own project. All these projects, very briefly and commonly, critically assess existing return policies and readmission policies from multiple perspectives, not only looking at destination countries, but also source and transit countries. They have a multi-actor perspective, so not only looking at states' policies, but also the role and involvement of meso-level actors like implementation actors, as well as non-state actors, including migrant organizations. Commonly, they study public preferences, attitudes for returns and readmission policies among the European Union publics, member states publics. And they commonly have a specific focus on what we are going to discuss today on partnerships, agreements, and arrangements around returns and readmissions, not between global countries, between the so-called global North and South, also the countries, neighboring countries in the South-South context. The structure of the panel after this very brief introduction is we have divided in two parts the webinar. In the first part, our speakers will discuss general trends and around returns and critically assess the policies and practices. Each speaker has 10 minutes to elaborate on their ideas and opinions. And before moving on to the second part, we will take questions from the audience. Please write your questions in Q&A box and then mention to whom you would like to address your questions. And in the second part, final part of the webinar, we will have an exploration of alternative ways. We will discuss about what can be done. So, and assess as well the alternative models. And each speaker will have 5 minutes to express their ideas about this. And again, we will take Q&A. We will have a short Q&A session for this. I would like to start with Professor Cardwell. In one of your recent articles, which I read about formal informality in European Union external migration governance, you use the term formal informality, formalization of informality, to describe governance tools and methods used to bypass the procedural formalities. How can we describe the formalization of informality in the return and readmission policies? Yes, the floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you also, firstly, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here virtually with some of these really fascinating projects as well that I'm really looking forward to hear about, and an extremely well attended. I just saw the participation number, and it's an extremely well attended. So thank you. Yeah, so I use this term formal informality, and I should really just explain where I'm coming from with that. I am, as you said in the very kind introduction, a lawyer, which always comes across like an apology, but isn't. It's the way in the structure and way in which I looked at migration, and primarily from the perspective of someone who is less a migration specialist than someone who's looked at the different facets of the EU's external relations and the EU's kind of actorness, and that's the way I've approached migration, rather than from migration as a substantive, and then look at the EU and what it tells us about the EU and the structure of law and governance. So the way that I approached this was really from looking at it over a decade now. What struck me was when you have the Tampere and then the Stockholm and the Hague programs back in the 2000s, putting into place the FSJ, the Freedom, Security and Justice sort of agenda. There was one part of it which really struck me, which was the use of all available tools in migration. Now, as a lawyer, a tool means that, well, we look at the treaty. That's always the frame of reference, because that tells us what the EU and its institutions can do, and in some cases cannot do. So tools for me says regulation, directive, decision, or certain other things which are particularly applied in what were previously the second and third pillar. Now, all available tools doesn't mean much for as a sort of pure lawyer, which I'm not, beyond that. So it really intrigued me as to, well, what is happening in this space, not necessarily about return and admission, but generally about, how this is the way forward. And that led on to this research agenda that I've had, culminating the book, which is definitely being written and which will definitely be out very, very soon, I hope. There, I've said it. Which is to think about, well, what this tells us about the nature of law and governance. And so the first point to say is that, well, we know that regulations and directives are not the answer to everything. We know that there are certain circumstances where they are not appropriate. And even where you do have a regulation directive, you need instruments on top of that to actually put them into practice. That's uncontroversial, and even as lawyers, we accept that. What really interested me then is, well, what happens when we don't have that step? What is being sort of missed out? So we know that migration is, you know, an extremely active area. We know that it's at the top of policy agendas. We've seen it rise up on sort of domestic, EU, international, but also in terms of the foreign policy of the EU and that sort of space, given the rather unique nature that an institutional format that the EU has. And on the one hand, having sort of innovations, if you like, in the way in which the EU do things isn't new. There's a whole research agenda from the 1990s about, often grouped together as new governance, about, well, you know, you can't regulate everything. What happened in some of these areas where the member states are kind of conscious about sovereignty, things like employment policy, social security, we know that there's not much harmonization. So you find other ways to do things, open method of coordination, benchmarking, twinning, mainstreaming, all of these kind of things, which lawyers have had a lot to say about as well. We haven't really seen it in migration, or does it exist in migration, but we're not used to looking at it, because the frames that we're used to looking at it tend to be rather positive. It's involving NGOs, it's involving citizenships and participation. Migration doesn't always work amongst the same logic. So really it was to try to uncover what happened there. Now, where the focus then on formal and formality came from is that we see a growing trend to use language which sounds like law, but actually isn't. So the best example of this, and the most well-known example that everyone here, I think, will be familiar with, is the EU-Turkey statement. Now, when that first appeared, it was referred to as an agreement. And in the ordinary English language sense of the word, it's an agreement. Yes, it's an agreement between one country and another group of countries that debated about who actually, you know, did put pen to paper. But let's say, you know, you've got two sides and they agree to do something. But once you say the word agreement, then that speaks to something which is actually laid down in the treaty. You know, the EU is empowered to make agreements with third countries, but it follows a certain set of procedural conditions. And this didn't, of course, meet them. And we know that it didn't, because unusually, we actually have the General Court, when it was challenged by three individuals as to, well, how do we challenge this law, which is part and part of a democratic legal system, we're told, well, there isn't actually anything here because it's not something from the EU. It's not something, it's between the states. Therefore, it's outside of our jurisdiction. And we see this again in the types of language being used. Deal, statement, MOU, you know, all of these things, they sound legal, but they're not. And that matters because when we say that the EU has an agreement, like a readmission agreement, we might not like the contents, we might debate it, but it has been through this process. And the problem is that when you're talking about migration, it matters because you're talking about human beings, you're talking about people who are vulnerable or who are in this sort of limbo very often in terms of the protection of their rights and who is responsible for them. So the idea of formal informality is that rather than formalizing it, it's that risk that we start using language which formalizes some of these practices, but without the procedural safeguards and with the risk of sidelining, for example, the European Parliament, but other democratic processes, including NGOs, to agree there. And we see this as a trend in the EU. We see it at the level of the member states, and we see it at level of non-member states, the UK being a good example of one as well. And so it's really about how that helps us to understand and to bring to light what is happening and what the dangers and the risks are. So to cut that short, essentially, yes, this type of mechanism might allow the EU to fulfill its goals, but again, at what cost might this be?
Yeah. This is a good point, Professor. So just I would like to ask you to elaborate more on the consequences of this, you know, this informal trend, you know, non-formality on the European Union's credibility, legitimacy, you know, this is clearly a trend. And then please elaborate more on this aspect. So, because I do understand the point. For example, there is a deadlock, you know, speaking about institutionally speaking about policy making, especially in the field of migration. They are trying to find a way to get it out. So where we can see some sort of innovation, but not all types of innovation, of course, lead to good positive consequences on all actors involved. Please.
Yeah,
It's yours.
so that's a challenging one. On the one hand, we expect the EU to be able to do things the public expects. And of course, we know that Brussels and the institutions always get blamed for inaction. And so I refer to the EU-Turkey statement. I mean, this is unusual in that the Commission was sort of trumpeting this as this is a model to follow. And that's where the concern comes in. Now, I think that here, this concerns the specificity of the EU, because these arguments could all apply to member states. So there is now growing research on what individual states do and how that fits with the EU picture, particularly Italy. We know about the Italy, Albania, again, deal, MOU, all of these kind of things. But what does it mean for the EU, itself? Now, here you've got a statement of values in the treaty, which include human rights, democracy, and the strict observance of international law, which also says that strict observance means, well, that's pretty clear what it means. And it means that trying to bypass those frames by this sort of shifting of borders and keeping people physically away so that they cannot then assert the rights that they have under, whether it's EU law, national law, international law, and so on, is extremely concerning. So I understand that the institutions are in a difficult position. They have to show that they're doing something. They're following the patterns of what member states have been doing for quite some time. But again, it's at what cost? And again, the reason why I say that that we have to consider the EU rather differently than the state is the other thing that I've been reflecting on as a UK-based Brit, albeit a dual citizen with an EU passport, is that the EU relies on public support. It's not guaranteed to always exist or exist in the form that it does. Now, it may be that the EU and its institutions win new fans by solving or tackling the migration crisis, too many air quotes, but at what cost? And what does that mean for people who view the EU as being representative of certain sets of values? And I think that needs to be considered in terms of what the EU is trying to do. It may be that say, well, actually, let's leave this space to the member states. Again, very difficult to do when you also have the internal mechanisms and so on as well. But I think in terms of credibility and in terms of the legitimacy, given that what the original purposes of the EU has been, and this constant question of, well, where does the EU go now? I think that has to be part of the equation.
Thank you, Professor. So we will get back to you with other questions. Now I will continue with Zeynep. Zeynep, I know you have conducted different research about especially countries in the global south. They're trying to understand their governance dynamics, but specifically about partnerships. Can you please assess the implementation of these partnerships? Based on some concrete cases like Lebanon, Jordan, Libya, Tunisia, and Iraq. What has worked and what did not work? So that can be the main leading question. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Soner, and also thanks to the Professor Cardwell to setting to the stage for us to understand this formal informality, which I'm very fond of the term and use the term in the recent publications. And before going to these implications, I want to stress on that we see in general, not only in the EU, but also the EU neighborhood countries, that there is this trend to enable returns as much as possible. And it takes different forms, at least, I mean, 3 forms I'm able to identify, and the countries are trying to push for returns before the migrants arriving to the country, and they're also trying to impose to the returns specifically those who are in a irregular situation or rejected asylum seekers, and also the countries are trying to incentivize in the returns. This is also these 3 trends we see both in the EU and the non-EU in the EU context, but in the EU format, these are more concretized through all these regulations and the policies over the years. And I see also some forms when it comes to the international cooperation over migration and specifically on return, the readmission. And the one, although, I mean, we know readmission agreements, right? Professor Cardwell said that, okay, these are, the agreements, they are clear and there's no, there's not that much question marks. Okay, there are question marks about them, but they are not, I mean, in terms of legality of them, there is not that much question marks. But there are other, the different experimentations about the cooperation models. The one is this region-to-region cooperation model, as we right now seeing between European Union and African Union. And in this agreement and this Europe initiative, Team of Europe initiative between African Union and the European Union, there are 5 pillars under scrutiny, and one of these pillars is the return, readmission, and sustainable reintegration. And although these 5 pillars is supposed to be, equally important, but we see that the first chunk of the budget is allowed, is channeled for the return and readmission side, and also the anti-smuggling. And the second mode of cooperation we see is this region to transit state. I say it in a transit state in a question mark because we know these transit states are also turning to the hosting states. In this case, the example is the European Union Tunisia Memorandum of Understanding, right? It has just, the signed, and it is mainly about economic cooperation, but it has a strong component on the migration and specifically the control of the irregular migration and the smuggling. And the agreement has these component to reinforce border management, speed up the return of the asylum seekers, and the money will be provided to the Tunisian authorities. And as we observe, there's a lot of, the contestation about whether EU funding will be directly help to the Tunisian authorities to increase their authoritarian tendencies. And actually this region to Trans-Tunisia type of memorandum of understanding, it is not a legally binding, it is just a memorandum of understanding. It also, the kind of remind us of the EU-Turkey deal and how it is taken as a, the kind of a model and expanded to others. Another mode of, cooperation we observe is these frontline member states to transit states, as we right now see with the Italy, Albania kind of, it's not a just agreement, it is a policy plan, let's say, but it is a very interesting policy plan because what it says that Italy will have a 2 proceeding center in Albania, north of Albania, and those who are trying to access to the Italy, the asylum seekers or the migrants, their asylum claims will be assessed in these centers in Albania, and Italian authorities will be responsible for these Albanian in these centers, and also they will be responsible for the resettlement if the person is found, claim found is legitimate, and also the deportation if needed. And the only thing what the Albanians will be doing, providing a security forces to do these processing centers. It is also something like, the EU-UK-Rwanda deal. But in this, in this case, Albanian Constitutional Court finds this is legal in a way that it is acceptable. And right now it is on the, it's on the table between, and I kind of a little hesitate speculating that this model can be kind of, imitated by other countries who are looking for to how to do, to stop to the migrants to before reaching their territories. And another model is more like, like German Iraq type of model, which is there is a kind of agreement, but this agreement is not that much known, but it is known that, the returns are happening through these agreements. I think how we can, when we put all these things together and how we can, assess their implementation. I think there's the Professor Cardwell tell us, and the first we should be assess their legality, to what extent they are legal at the EU level and also to the member state level. And the second is who is benefited from these agreements. Whether the origin country or the destination country, or there are private actors around, and also the migrants themselves, who is these deals are benefiting, at the same time, who is these agreements are kind of putting in a very disadvantageous position. And another thing is whether they fulfill their objectives. I see that at the the EU level, although the idea is to make return governance more in order, but all these type of different bilateral and multi-level agreements making the return governance more messier than it is used to be. And it didn't bring the order to the system, but more complexity, and also the potential for the extraction of the value. And the very last thing maybe I will add, and then we can follow in the other section as well. I think these policies are making migrants more instruments or bargaining chips for the negotiation tables. It is not only from the EU side, but also when you look at from the the transit or the origin country sides, and the case studies on Morocco, Moldova, and the Turkey, and also Western Balkans show us that these countries are also started to negotiate over controlling the migration or accepting to the return rights. This is making more instrumentalizing or the weaponizing to the migration and the return issue. I think for genuine cooperation, we should be really also considering what are the priorities and interests of the origin countries. In our project, this is one of our ideas to more zoom in on to the origin countries, but also the migrants themselves as a stakeholder of these all partnership models. I'm going to stop here, and if we have time, I will continue. Second round.
Before you stop, Zeynep, one thing that come up in my mind, so all these agreements, deals, whatever we call them, they are portrayed in the public as like win-win solutions, What do you think about this? So, because since we are critically assessing this policies or agreements.
Yeah, I mean, this win-win or triple win discourse is not new. Right now, it is only adapted to this return readmission thing. But we don't see that it's not fully win-win position for both the destination and the origin country, and also the migrants themselves. Just one example, maybe some of you followed in the media last week. The African Union Commission chairman made a public statement, right? He said that when there was this discussion about the EU-African Union talks, and he said that African countries would have liked to have been consulted beforehand and didn't want to be more empty pledges, meaning that often by the partnerships, we approach in a unilateral approach, not a, the genuine cooperation between the two parties, but a more, one party, in this case, EU is wanting something, and then, the others are kind of find themselves to negotiate that. And here, I think this is one, and at the end of the day, although it is known that there are many agreements, including the readmission agreements, but they don't fulfill to the objective, and also there are many implications, problems at the implementation stage. And if we don't design these, the partnerships in a more inclusive way, it's very clear that they will bring more implementation gaps at the end. And I have a huge question mark about this win-win narrative when it comes to the return and the migration issues in general.
Yes, thank you, Zeynep. We will get back to this question again. I think there is also a media representation about this win-win discourse, Usually it's the way it's portrayed. So we don't hear much about the contested the discourses which are against this type of arrangements or agreements. Therefore, we don't discuss much about them. And then I would like to continue with Professor Leerkes on similar questions. How do you see, Professor Leerkes, the situation? How do you assess European Union's return and readmission policies, and also the consequences for European Union's credibility, legitimacy, and plus unintended consequences of cooperation on return and readmission? What are the positive and negative lessons can be drawn from these models? The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe first some comments or reflections about the term informality. because I'm a sociologist and political scientist, maybe more sociologist than political science. And for sociologists, it seems a little bit strange to call these things that are clearly written and very bureaucratic, informal. So because they're still formal in many ways. So maybe, yeah, we have to also consider that term a little bit. I don't know. So it stands out more that they are not binding. So maybe that's the difference. And indeed, they don't constitute law in that sense. And also, what makes them different is that they're indeed less procedural safeguards. So that for certain statements, for example, they're not parliaments do not have to approve the contents of these statements. So there is the real differences, but yeah, I wonder. I never use informal. As a sociologist, it seems strange to call that informal. So then, yeah, so it is clear in terms of the trends what we have seen in terms of these intergovernmental frameworks, as we call them, return frameworks, that there's a trend towards more EU-wide agreements. So EU-wide frameworks. So what we see is that different European countries have tried to pool their power more and then try to negotiate en bloc with one non-EU country. So that's one trend. The other trend is indeed to move a little bit away from these binding readmission agreements. And you see a third trend that increasingly try to of conditionality. They try to link up cooperation on enforced return with other policy issues such as visa facilitation or development aid, trade. So then in terms of how do I see that? So it is, let's say, informalization or the move towards non-binding frameworks. I think, well, if it's really a complement of the aim for agreements, I think it's not necessarily a bad thing. Also what Professor Cardwell says, yeah, you cannot capture everything in these official agreements. But of course, it's when it really becomes an alternative, I think it's problematic, and I think we see that now here. But there's more in general in Europe. We see this sort of institutional contradictions between us being like liberal states and apparently being advocates of the international human rights regime on the one hand, and on the other hand also the securitization of irregular migration, which then can lead to a sort of state of exception. That's also used in the literature, so that normal procedural safeguards then suddenly are not important anymore. So we really have to be careful, I think, with this move, because what we may or may not win in the short run risk undermining, I think, our credibility in the long run. So I think that's we really should be careful. And then there's the question of apart from the legal legitimacy, there's also the question of do these frameworks work? Is the move towards this more informalization, was that a smart move or not? And then it also relates to more the question of sociological legitimacy. Is it accepted by those who then implement these things? So we're going to look into these things in the FAIR project more, because there's a lot we do not know about this. Maybe that's also important to point out that there's not been a lot of research, also not a lot of real good statistical research. There have been some descriptive studies on the effects of these things. I've personally also done a more like multivariate analysis with the Eurostat data, but there's also difficulties with the data. So this is certainly something we also need to work on in the field as researchers, and also if there are like policy advisors in the room, please make available better data, because it's really important to have a better debate about these things and to have a more evidence-informed policy field. But what we've seen so far with the data limitations is that these informal agreements are not necessarily very effective. I mean, these agreements in general a lot of them are not very effective. Maybe the EU-Turkey statement was kind of an exception, but I think there's a lot was also involved in terms of transfer of resources, and that's quite atypical. If you look at the more general frameworks like the EU readmission framework with visa facilitation, or even the mobility partnerships, or other statements such as with Afghanistan, you don't see that they are very effective. In fact, maybe we do not see any effects, to be honest. But it's certainly not the case that the ones that are not legally binding are then more effective. It's rather the other way around if we see anything. If we do see if we look at what characteristics do matter for the effectiveness of the return agreements in terms of promoting enforced return, it's actually, and that's also interesting, is only the bilateral agreements that seem to have some effect. So the things, and that can be readmission agreements, can also be bilateral memorandum of understanding, that these seem to have some effects on the rate of return, whereas for the European initiative, we do not see anything, to be honest. And even in some cases, in some models, we see actually like a negative effect of certain, especially sort of these statements or the CAM, some initiatives that are informal and are also not associated with a lot of incentives. In some models, we actually see the negative effect for these kinds of things. So. But so I would say the move to informalization, if you can call it that way, it's problematic from a legal perspective, but also in terms of the sociological legitimacy and the effectiveness, you don't see strong evidence that this really is the way to go.
Thank you, Professor. I would like to add one question. So just this trend for more intergovernmentalism, especially within European Union, and also you pointed out move away from like binding agreements, like in the sense of informality, less responsibility, less transparency and accountability, and then different issue linkages in these arrangements, like conditionality. Can you please elaborate more on these aspects? This especially, how do you see, for example, this return readmission policies, if I may ask? So against the backdrop of, as you know, the politics, the plans just put on table by the far-right political party in Germany, AfD. So their clear deportation plans. So when we just open the Pandora box, for example,
yes.
How do you see the link? So just please.
Okay. Yeah, well, so that's why we also were called FAIR, because we're interested also in the legitimacy of these return agreements, return frameworks, both from a legal perspective, but also more like sociological, empirical sense. How are they perceived by those who implement them, or who have to speak also to their citizenry? And what is clear, I think, is that, well, obviously, maybe incentives do not necessarily hurt, but it depends on also the type of incentives that is offered and also the ways in which it is offered. I think what is often overseen, I think, is that it's not only like a very called quid pro quo and everything goes. I think what is really important for these agreements to work is that something is agreed upon in a way that is really generally accepted by all the parties agreeing to it, and not really pressured into something upon a weaker partner. So, and also that the incentives that are offered then are also seen as an appropriate incentive for what is asked. So that's why I also think that the link, for example, with development aid is more problematic than, for example, the link with legal migration, or even and then I thought that visa facilitation was a good step in that direction. But if you look at it, it's really very limited, because the only thing, it doesn't really change the rules. It's just to make the process a little bit easier. So there's also quite actually weak linkage there. So in my view, so yes, incentives can work. But they have to be also add to the legitimacy of the whole system, in the sense that what is agreed is coherent, makes sense for everybody. And that for me this means that if Europe wants to have a good return project policy, we would also have to accept some measure of legal migration or resettlement, labor migration. There's no way you can really fully keep the door closed and then at the same time expect cooperation. That's my view on it.
Okay, thank you. We will continue with Professor Olga Jubany. Professor Jubany, I guess you would like to introduce a little bit your project, but also I would like to ask you from a normative point of view, to what extent can we critically assess return policies without a questioning of the rationale behind returns? What are the underlying motivations of the returns policy? And to what extent it is useful to elaborate policy without taking into account those that implement it and experience it on a daily basis? So this is the leading question, but please feel free to comment, give your insights about the previous questions and the contributions. The floor is yours.
Hello, hi, thanks. Thank you so much. Thank you for organizing this and listening to very, very interesting contributions. They're all very relevant. I mean, yes, relevant to the question that you're asking me. I mean, which is actually at the core of our project. So yes, I think I know your projects have been already developed for quite a while, like a year or so. Was our project, as you know, the MORE project has just started. I have a presentation. I'm not sure we need to. If you want, I can put the presentation, or I can just explain a bit. I mean, I just think it could be useful to just set the framework of the MORE project. As you know, the MORE project, which is coordinated from us at the University of Barcelona. I'm an anthropologist, a social professor in social anthropology, and I think you would see the impact of this approach of our discipline also on the way, as opposite perhaps to some of the more from law or so on, or even sociology, as our colleague now was portraying. But as I said, the MORE project, entitled Motivations, Experiences and Consequences of the Return Readmission Policy, Revealing and Developing Effective Alternatives, has 11 partners. I'm not sure I need to list them all. I think you know them, but just very briefly, is the UP, University of Barcelona's coordinator, the Ca' Foscari in Italy, Libre Bruxelles University in Belgium, PICUM, of course, also in other projects, the Peace Institute in Slovenia, the MOB Center in Greece, Linköping University in Sweden, George Ostertag University in Göttingen in Germany, also the Center for European Policy Studies in Belgium, and the Center on Migration Policy and Society Compass at the University of Oxford. I think it would be interesting, perhaps, and I think it addresses quite a bit of the question that you put forward, to share with you very, very briefly why the project came to be. And as you know, of course, there was the call that we all submitted to, published in 21 about the Returns and Readmission Directive. And it stemmed from this sort of ineffectivity approach that we've been talking about today as well, that has very much dominated the discourse around, again, illegalized migration in Europe. And in fact, this is one of the questions I would like to put forward as well to the fore, which is, what do we mean by effectiveness? Not so much, even now we're talking, is this effective, is not effective? Effective, what do we mean? Effective by whom? Is it effective, the number of returns? Is that the effectiveness we're looking for? Or the win-win, same thing. But anyway, moving from here, when we saw the call, it searched ways to improve this kind of return, the return directive, when actually many of us, and I'm talking particularly from this kind of humanities approach, humanities kind of disciplines, got particularly concerned that there was a call addressed to or calling for projects that improve a directive that has been, analyzed deeply, and many authors like Arango and so on have described as the directive of shame, for obvious reason of being oppressive, for criminalizing as it does, is a punitive as well approach that this directive has that violates many fundamental and many human rights. So in light of this, we decided to sort of put forward some kind of what's often called in this kind of jargon a counter call. So what we did, we developed a proposal that challenged the underlying principles on this call, and that means by extend the underlying principles of the Return and Readmission Directive and policies on the whole as an approach. This what we did then with these proposals put it as together research that challenged the foundation of this systemic oppression that legitimates the emergence of return and readmission policy in the first place. We think something, I understand it's an approach that these other researchers perhaps are not undertaking, but it's, to me, this is even more so, even more reason for, complementing the different projects. But what we did, therefore, was with this project, we problematize very much the emergence, as I say, of the return and readmission policy in the first place by looking at its origins, problematizing as well the origins, motivation, objectives that this policy pursues, questioning its consolidation as well. And I think this is, to me, very important as the privileged response to irregularity. And ultimately, what we did is focus on its devastating consequences on the ground, on those subject to it, mainly. So, to our great surprise, I have to admit, the proposal was selected for funding, and I say great surprise because, as you know, it's not that common that you undertake a counter call and that gets a counter call in the sense of, a critical approach to what's suggested to do, and you get funded together with our colleagues. They got funded as well. So this is more or less how we came to be. And of course, we can talk more about the MORE project. I would be thrilled to share, more details, but driving it a bit more now towards this critical assessment of policies, as you were raising regarding new partnership and cooperation models, particularly with third countries in relation to migration. What we believe is that the first question we must ask is to what extent can we assess policy in terms of what is working and what it isn't working, when we actually think that the problem of these partnerships agreements are intending to address something that somehow is a fiction that derives from EU wider migration policies or policy approach to migration. And this is, for example, the European Commission's migration partnership framework, for instance, that takes this main long-term objective to address the root and causes of irregular migration, as you know. Not the causes of migration, but the causes of irregular migration. But irregular migration, of course, does not have different cause than migration, as we know. The only distinctive cause of irregular migration is that distinction created by the EU and its member state policies. So the way control and restriction of migration is approached in Europe, we believe, is what generates in the first place the possibility of irregular migration. This is what generates this main paradox, which is at the core of the MORE projects, which is, as the migration policies that are supposed to be evaluated in terms of improvement, are we talking here? Improvement of the management of irregular migration, but these are the policies generating the irregularity in the first place. And I think we too often skip that part, and this is what we want to focus on. So to address the question of how to provide critical assessment of policies and practices, we believe we have to go back to question how we have come to build up a whole set of policies and legislation on this fiction of irregular migration. And therefore, the aim of MORE of this project precisely is to undertake this critical and genealogical approach to understanding the origins, purposes, motivations, of this return and policies and the rationale that sustains it. Hence, the first part of the MORE project focuses precisely on these. We're looking at the successive formulation of policies, political discourses, they all came up here, and debates, and they're interlocking with public opinions. And in here, I would like to just point out, in relation to something Zin said also this morning, that we tend to look at how public opinion as a driver for policy, but I think it's very important to also be critical and look at how policy is also a driver of public opinion. That is just, again, a question I throw here on the floor. So with this, MORE is also exploring whether there is a continuity between current oppressive policies of mobility, control within the nation states, and the colonial configurations of the past. As you know, something we've been working on a lot of the partners that are in this consortium, that is more, and that means looking at the transformation of the last 50 years on the structures of this subjugation of the other, or this threatening stranger. You know, while we keep on talking, we keep putting very many different labels, some of which I came up this morning, on what you know, the Zeynep has more recently suggested as this third world looking people, subject of migration control. So this is generated by an order in which the regularity sort of dichotomy within is cemented. Hence, I said that there's this fallacy about irregularity, because it's reaffirmed the state power to categorize and label these non-citizens. This is a rubric, I think, that determines the problematization of migration, which sustains and justifies this kind of permanent state of exception, which we are discussing today, you know, with its legitimacy as well, through a discursive of these rhetorics of emergency and threat and danger, and on the whole, somehow social construction process that normalizes what we should be extraordinary control measures, including the partnership that we're discussing today, the cooperation deals, whatever deals are. My colleagues will talk about that, or also, well, we've been talking about it this morning. What are these deals, you know, that are normalizing this exception that needs to be closed, you know, and this kind of fiction of irregular migration as an existential security threat. I think a lot of these agreements we're discussing today, they take this for granted, and I believe we need to question that, because by doing so, the state assumes the impunity to exercise violence through policing, surveillance, detention, deportations, as we know, and basically any form of control that would not be accepted otherwise. In this framework, the More Project assumes that migration policies embody this logic of threat. And I think that is fairly clear, and we all could agree that this hierarchical order creates and manifests through the labels by which people are observed, they are understood, conditioning also how they are treated, excluded, rejected, discriminated against, and ultimately expelled from society. And we need to be reminded of this all the time, and particularly in discussions like the one we are having today. It looks at the pathways that we have led the European Union and other countries in the global north, of course, to legalize the removal of undesired population, and examines the constructions of political rationale of what has been framed, named, and analyzed, and should be called by its name, I think, in these discussions as the deportation regime. This implies examining, and this is something that's come up here, and I'll be very briefly closing now, not only how the legal framework are created, as I've been saying, but also how is negotiating in this kind of shifting context that we've been talking now, sometimes according to the letter of the law. We've been saying that now. We've been talking already about this, you know, this different categorization, whilst, you know, disregarding its intent and purpose often as well. So it also means problematizing the public rationale. We talk about that already, interrogating how this is presented and justified in the political and normative discourses, as well as in popular narrative. And just very briefly, the second point that is critical to us, that couldn't be otherwise, as I say, we are social anthropologists, is how do we construct, you know, this idea of policy success? And you asked me that. We cannot uncritically assess policy and its goals, moreover, without questioning this ideal scenario that policies kind of, you know, assess against, and particularly what we believe in more, we cannot assess policy without looking at the experiences of those that are implementing it. And I think Professor Cardwell was talking already about this lived law, and we believe very much about exploring these experiences of those who are implementing it on the ground. And of course, even more importantly, without the experiences of those who are subject to these policies, who are the target of these policies, and who experience it on the daily basis. So it is in here, which again, for example, looking at this easy migration partnership framework, we can see return and readmission deals are presented as a win-win. We were talking now about this win-win. That's why I wanted to throw back the question to us, you know, to this forum in relation to these partnership agreements, and whether we must first question, you know, whether it has an effectively been a win-win, but what win-win for whom? You know, what kind of win we are talking about before we, you know, come to address whether this is, you know, a win. We need to think what do we mean by that. Anyway, from here we go into ethnography. I can talk a bit more. I don't want to take more of the floor, but to us, going into this ethnography in terms of ethnographic approach towards the everyday of the tangible significances of those individuals subject to control of these policies is critical. You know, looking at those living under the threat of detention, for instance, and deportation, you know, this pursues this thicker understanding, which I think needs to come into this kind of forums, where how this policy is made real beyond the discussion, how it's actually made real on the ground to try and overcome the potential reductionist explanations otherwise of the significances and experiences of the different actors. I think I will leave it here if you wish, but I'm happy to address more questions.
Okay, thank you, Professor Jubany, so for just raising critical concerns about certain topics around return, especially the construction, social construction of regularity, irregularity, these kind of categories that we are always dealing with whenever we discuss about return. It is like just a big dilemma, but always keeping in mind, I think, this kind of issues, you know, this kind of understanding in the background would help when we even talk in terms of very rationalist assessment theories, you know. There is some sort of reality, but what I would like to add here, sometimes it's so important to see both what is going on the ground, but also there are like some universalistic perspectives, you know, that we have to just use in our assessments. Not only for betterment of policies, but also just to what extent we can just propose alternatives. There are some questions from the audience. I would like to merge these questions with the second round and give the floor for the final for a final return to our speakers. As we mentioned in the beginning, we will discuss in the final round the way forward, basically alternative ways. What alternatives do already exist? What are they not used as preferred solutions to the situation of people living in administrative irregularity within the European Union? And in what ways should the European Union broaden the scope of the partnerships and embed them in other policy areas? How can the European Union develop a more inclusive approach and establish a more holistic dialogue with countries of origin, civil society organizations, and invest in regional bodies? And I would also like to ask any suggestions if the speakers have. And then I look at the questions posed here. One question goes for Zeynep from Arjen Leerkes from Lebanese Immigration Research Center. And do you see the question, Zeynep?
Yeah, I see, and also I guess Eugenie is in, you know, in a hurry to catch up the class. We can in contact Eugenie, and I can respond to your question. We have very, you know, the very recent policy brief about the topic, returns from Lebanon to Syria. And if you allow me, Soner, I can address this question, also other question about Afghanistan, or what you want.
Since you just took the floor, okay, so that's fine. So you can continue, I think, with these two questions and plus my general questions about the final round. Please, the floor is yours.
Very very quickly, yeah, as I said in the beginning, the returns is not only the issue right now for the European countries, but also to the main hosting countries, mainly in Lebanon, Turkey, and Pakistan. There's a huge debates and some ad hoc regulations and policies to returning to the large number of the refugees or asylum seekers in these countries. It is clear, I mean, in the Syria case, it is quite complex because there is not yet a peace agreement or tripartite agreement assuring to the repatriation of the Syrians in the neighboring countries. But also there is a large number of spontaneous returns and rush of, you know, the Lebanese and the Turkish authorities to facilitate these returns. I think here is very clear, very important to keep in mind that all returns is supposed to comply with the principles of voluntariness, safety, dignity, and sustainable return. And NGOs can give us support in this regard, not only for the ensuring the voluntariness, but also for the dignified and the safe returns, and also for the, you know, the monitoring. Right now, as far as I know, UN and IOM, not very clearly within this, I mean, very ad hoc basis, because the situation is a little complex in the country. But there is no doubt that there is an urgent need for monitoring and also for reintegration of the returns. Actually, this is linking to my comment about the question about Afghanistan and Nigeria. And yes, it's true that Turkey return rates of Turkey from Afghanistan is very, very high. Actually, Turkish Directorate of Migration Management is very proud that there's 70% return rate from Turkey to the Afghanistan by the charter flights. If our effectiveness is only the return rates, yes, but it's a very big question mark. What happens to the returnees? And also, do you know and what happens these people after, you know, whether they are engaging in again to the migration, and often our field work in Afghanistan show that actually GAPS has a partner, a very important partner in Afghanistan, and they are conducting a survey with the returnees from Turkey and also from the EU countries, and their results will give us some evidences what happens to the returnees and how it happens in their, not only reintegration in a technical term, but in terms of well-being of these people and their, you know, the hope and their aspirations about the life. This is what I think we should keep in mind when thinking about effectiveness of return and reintegration. Very last point is also addressing the Ngozi question about reintegration. I think in this policy partnership, there is always this facilitating the legal migration and the return on the same package, but more obsession with the return, while less, you know, less obsession with the legal migration, expanding to the means of legal migration and protection. I think these components should be taken equally important by those who are engaging in these cooperation agreements. And I'm going to stop here.
Okay, thank you, Zeynep. I will give the floor to Professor Cardwell, just to reflect on the main question about alternatives, if he has any suggestions. And so there are like some questions posed on the Q&A box. One last question just come up is the implication of post-colonial hierarchies and sidelining critical thinkers on the European Union's credibility. This is a question just asked to you and Professor Jubany. Yeah, please, the floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you. I mean, the first thing I'd say is it's always difficult to sort of say how can things be improved for exactly the reason that my colleague Professor Jubany said, that it's about do we necessarily want to you know to sort of help on this. I think what we would want is for things to be for partnerships to work on the basis of improving the lives of everyone, rather than doing so under the guise of returning people who don't want to be returned. I mean, I think what I'd say is a general structuring point here, having looked at neighborhood policy over a long time, and that question of, you know, how do you get effective engagement with the neighborhood. I think one of the things that's always been striking is about, we often focus on the kind of top level and sort of government level things, which don't always lead to things. If you start promising, you know, a sort of a free trade area and so on, these things are sort of doomed to fail unless it's through enlargement, which we know isn't open for, you know, countries in North Africa and so on. And you can contrast the sort of the sort of ways in which the European neighbourhood policy has been successful and not the ones that would necessarily be at the forefront. So this kind of funding of projects and reaching directly into relations with NGOs, with groups and so on that have actually done not always, you know, large scale work, but hasn't had to go through a sort of government filter and things like that is where the value has lied. Unfortunately, we place the emphasis on, you know, sort of high level, you know, government meetings, and you know, the most obvious example of that was President Sarkozy of France trying to, you know, create a union for the Mediterranean and getting, you know, every leader in place, and you know, that looked impressive in terms of a family photo of countries that don't, well, I say family in the loosest possible way, of countries that don't really speak to each other in any format. And what happened after that? Nothing. I mean, or at least nothing that we could see from the way in which it was presented. And that takes the focus away on what the actual benefit is. So in that case, I think that's the thing that speaks to this question of broadening out partnerships and what does it actually mean. It replicates, in a sense, one of the, and again, I'm also thinking of Brexit. I try not to mention it, and now I've done it twice, that, you know, one of the advantages was that local councils or organizations could apply directly for funding rather than go through, you know, a national government. That was one of the advantages that we've seen in regional development, which of course no longer applies in the UK. However, so it's one of those things that you do sort of software which doesn't perhaps get the attention that it deserves, and would do some of the things would actually might, if the aim is to stop people using irregular means or so on, or who are being returned, actually help. In terms of the questions, question we addressed, so can the European Parliament be more proactive? I mean, yes, it can, and the European Parliament has a very, very long history of getting things onto the agenda, of raising things, even where it has limited competence. So development policy, I've written on this a little bit. I'm not a specialist on that either, but I've written on with a colleague on how the Parliament managed to, over time, incrementally, by consistently showing its interest, asking the questions, and using the means that it does have, which include budgetary, financial, procedural. Again, it's boring procedure, but it works to get this high-level stuff on the agenda. That's what it can do, and we do see in the European Parliament some parliamentarians, you know, doing this. The danger is, of course, we can't always assume the European Parliament as a body will act in the way, for exactly the point that's mentioned by Hassan. I think I saw it somewhere later on that you know, that does as at the moment. But what happens if the nature of the European Parliament and those all-important speaking rights changes in the forthcoming elections? Again, what kind of Europe is it we're going to be, or European Union are we going to be seeing emerging from that? I'll leave the question of post-colonial hierarchies, but I think well, I'll leave it to a certain extent. But just to say that, it refers to an earlier question which I haven't seen. Critical thinkers isn't a new priority. Yeah, I mean, in terms of instrumentalizing returns, I mean, I think here we're often seeing, you know, the success, as it's seen from the perspective of member states, is on numbers, and often not even numbers, but sort of having something in place. And we see a lot, and again, using the example of the UK Rwanda, which obviously here I'm following a lot. It's almost as if the actual numbers of people who are going to be sent, and okay, it's not returns because they're not returning, but it's operating on the same logic. It's more that, oh, this is going to be a deterrent, which also means that, well, how do you measure its success and so on? And those kind of critical voices are largely absent, particularly from, in this case, Rwanda, but it can be from any of the partner countries or transit countries as to what this means. But we do see, you know, growing concern about, well, actually, EU and EU law is not immune from sort of debates about decolonization. Just because the EU is itself not very old as a legal system, it doesn't mean it's immune from it. You know, far from it. It's inherited colonial systems of law common to many of the member states. Yeah, I hope that helps a bit. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I will give the floor in order to Professor Leerkes, then we will just close with Professor Jubany. Yes, Professor Leerkes, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. So what is the way forward? Yeah, so if we think about maybe more the reform agenda that I think we have, what I think is that maybe some more better collaboration on returns would be possible, but I think that it would require that there's more genuine efforts to really obtain genuine mutual understanding of what is needed. For example, I think that the EU-wide deals, for example, where you have the EU negotiating en bloc with one country, I think is probably not the best setup to do something like that. For example, I've talked about more opportunities for legal migration resettlement. I also think what it really needs to be delved in more is monitoring systems for indeed the reintegration of people. So at the moment, there's no learning, there's no feedback. So what we also would want is that if the outcomes are really bad, I mean, then of course maybe these groups also should not be returned. And there's no learning, I think, now at the moment, or hardly any learning. So that's, I think, a way forward. And then also there's that talks about alternatives. I think what also needs to be done is that European politicians become more honest, also to European voters, in saying, look, this system is never going to be 100% watertight effective. There's going to be a big group that we tell that does not receive protection, for example, is rejected in the asylum procedure, but will still stay in Europe. We just know that it's there, and so I think what we also a way forward will also be to learn more about what can be done with that group in a positive way, and also to learn more about what people accept in among European voters in terms of different regularizations opportunities, for example. And it's also still such a schizophrenic situation in Europe that you have this demographic deficits, and there's a lot of Europe imports a lot of labor, and it will need to import even more so in the coming 10 to 15 years. And at the same time, there is this securitization, and which is on a complete different chess board, it seems. So then I was wondering, I think we need to experiment a little bit more with, trying to bring these two things a little bit closer to each other, I think.
Thank you very much, Professor Leerkes. Yes, Professor Jubany, the floor is yours. There was also one particular question posed to you, the last one about the implication of post-colonial hierarchies and sidelining critical thinkers.
Right.
And
Yes, I think we have just very few minutes, so I'll just I'll go into the alternatives. But before, I'm very happy to see this question, because this is what's stem at the core of our project, the understanding that yes, there is this hierarchical legacy that we carry from the colonial and so on. I mean, there's been of course is a long debate, but that it tends to happen at a certain more abstract levels, and doesn't often goes to the policy level to question what we're doing, to question those categories, those labels that we use, to question this dichotomy, legality, illegality, because there are many also, let's not be naive, interest around those categorizations. And it's this, I think this is what we should do with projects like that, precisely to unravel these from the inheritance that we have, and how alternative ways, which is where we're discussing right now as well, can get over this idea of migration as an existential security threat, filled with all these undesirable people who want to come in and so on. And also because this inheritance kind of legitimizes certain actions that I don't think otherwise, certain impunities of the state, as we know, impunity to exercise violence, impunity to deport someone. I don't think this would be able to happen without the use of these categories and labels. that are indeed the result of this inheritance. So yes, I do think that this logic of this logic of existential security threat, I was saying, of exemption, I mean, it's important to recognize it together with this hierarchical order, and both create these labels which people are then, as I was saying earlier, not only observed and understood, but also people are ultimately expelled from a territory where they live. And back to this, so sorry, just bottom line, I do think we need research into that and not take all this for granted. And just a note on this alternative, again, the Moore project perhaps undertakes a different outlook to the concept of these pathways to the future as alternative measures, because we believe there are alternatives to the whole return and readmission, the whole return logic. We think that there are alternative ways to look at it from much more dignified, sustainable solution. What we wonder in the first place is why is returning the preferred option? It doesn't work in any term anyway. Whatever winning is, it still doesn't. It's not happening. So why is it still the preferred solution for public authorities and so on? We can find alternative ways, alternative answers that provides some different opportunities for people to live their life as they desire. And there are alternatives that we think challenges all these return apparatus. We know it's not easy, but this is the project we're talking about. And these alternative policies, we think they can offer paths, even if they are partial, if they're not global, to this other migration, return approach, and also some kind of solutions I don't like, but yet way forward, for managing, administrating for the way forward for this irregularity situation in Europe. And this alternative, from the Moore approach, from the approach of the Moore project, they can go from different, as I said, from local to distinct responses, from strengthening protection systems to regularization, for example, to family reunification, of course, plans for also municipal ID that provide rights and services. I don't know if I'm explaining this kind of logic to alternative, kind of thinking outside the box of return. How can we, make life better for people who are here in irregular conditions that our policy has put them in there in the first place. And we think that as such, these strategies may vary from offering, as I say, full regularization. And in here, we could talk about different, approaches to this alternative, hegemonic or non-hegemonic, but anyway, full regularization would, of course, be to locally accepted statuses, for example, as it happens across Europe in different countries, Spain, for instance, of civil society, aimed to avoiding precisely, as I said, not alternatives to improve, but alternatives to somehow avoid the predators of return in Europe, as I said, to a more dignified and even sustainable solutions.
Thank you, Professor. If our panelists, they don't have anything substantial to add, I would like to close the webinar. Yeah, just a few final points for our conclusion. Thanks a lot for our panelists, speakers, and all the audience members for attending today's webinar. I think we touched upon important issues concerning return, readmission agreements, and how to understand return policies. By addressing, I think, the missing or the lacking points, what's the problems in existing policies, we try to, in a way, shape the main parameters of alternatives. So what can be done? So if these are the problems, for example, we see a clear trend towards non-formality, informality, intergovernmentalism, sidelining or bypassing migrants, civil society actors from policy making, just bypassing the legal procedures more and the critical voices, especially just bypassing or just silencing critical voices. If we use these aspects to build the alternatives, I'm sure so we will just find good ways to go. It's always the most problematic thing. From my side, what I would add, one point to tackle again against misinformation is an important issue when we discuss about migration and return migration, because it is discussed purely on numbers, the success, you know, and lots of lies and misinformation is circulated among publics. This is one thing that we need to just provide as projects, I would say. The second thing is, if we want to discuss this topic in a very productive way, constructive way, the one thing is just also to just tackle against politicization of this topic. This is also another trend that we should take into consideration. By these words, I would like to close the webinar. Before closing, I would like to announce that the recordings of this webinar will be available on our joint YouTube channel and on all projects' websites, and it will be disseminated through social media. Please keep in tune. And the next upcoming webinar will take place, just let me just 1 second, the poster on the 13th of March at 1 o'clock Central European Time, about politics of irregularity, moderated by Ilse van Liemt from Utrecht University, and the speakers are Lena Nare, Paula Merikoski from University of Helsinki, Sabrina Marchetti, and Letizia Palumbo from University of Venice. Please use the link provided for registration in the chat box, and also you can get information on our project websites about this upcoming event. Thanks a lot for attending today's webinar.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Thanks a lot.